If you've spent any time online searching for answers to anxiety, you've probably heard people say something like, anxiety is lying to you, as if that's meant to put your mind at rest. But if anxiety is lying to you, then that means there's a part of your own mind deliberately trying to frighten you. And of course, that's not actually what's happening. But it's also not the case that every anxious thought you have is true. So what if there's a third possibility? What if your mind is simply trying to tell you the truth, but it just keeps getting things wrong? After all, making mistakes isn't evidence that you're in some way broken. It's actually a healthy part of being human. So that might just mean that when you're experiencing high levels of anxiety, even to the point where it feels debilitating, there's actually nothing to worry about at all. Hi, I'm Tim Box, mind coach and anxiety therapist. For the last 15 years, I've been working with clients to help them get the other side of their anxiety issues and start enjoying life without anxiety getting in the way. And if you're a regular to the channel, then you'll know in the past I've had my own personal journey with anxiety. And one of the biggest shifts that helped me understand my own anxiety response was realizing I didn't have to choose between two extremes. For years, it seemed as though there were only two ways of looking at anxious thoughts. Either they were telling me the truth and therefore I should be worried, or anxiety was some sort of liar that kept feeding me frightening stories, and therefore I should be really worried. Neither explanation ever sat comfortably with me. If my anxious thoughts were true, then life was pretty scary and I wasn't equipped to deal with it. If anxiety was lying to me, then it wasn't the world that was scary, it was my own mind. Now, after years of struggle, I no longer believe either of those things. I think anxiety is doing what healthy human minds do all day, every day. It's trying to make sense of the world. Sometimes it gets that right, sometimes it gets it wrong. The important thing to understand is that getting things wrong isn't the same as being broken. It's simply part of being human. So if you're watching this and you're human, please continue, because the next bit applies to you. One of the most obvious ways our mind gets things wrong is that it consistently overestimates how likely bad things are to happen. For example, you might think that bad things happen all the time, and you might have evidence in the shape of memories of the bad stuff that's happened to you. But think back over the last year. How many ordinary days have you had? Days when nothing much happened. Now, I'm not talking about days when you felt anxious. I'm not talking about days when you struggled emotionally. I'm talking about days when something really bad actually happened to you, as opposed to the days when you imagined it might. I'm guessing probably hundreds. Days where you got up, went to work, came home, watched television, had dinner, went to bed, and nothing particularly dramatic happened at all. As much as Ronan Keating might like to think that life is a roller coaster, most of the time it's pretty boring. Now think about the days you remember most clearly. They're probably the unusual ones: the holiday, the bereavement, the promotion. Our minds naturally remember the things that stand out, not just because they had the biggest emotional impact, but also because they were the unusual days. So when an anxious mind starts trying to predict the future, it's working from a very distorted picture of reality. It remembers the exceptions and fails to notice the ordinary. That's why catastrophizing feels so convincing, not because catastrophe is likely, but because our attention naturally gets drawn towards the memorable rather than the mundane. Another mistake our mind makes is one we've spoken about a lot on this channel. It becomes frightened of anxiety itself. This one has always fascinated me because it's at the heart of any anxiety issue. The idea that the thing we feel most anxious about is how anxious we are. So if we notice our heart beating faster or our breathing changing or an excessive amount of tension in our body, we start to feel anxious about that. And as a result, we create more of these sensations. And it's all based on our mind deciding that feeling that way means something must be wrong with me. It's an understandable conclusion, but it's a mistaken one. Feeling anxious has never been evidence that you're ill. It's never been evidence that your body is malfunctioning. It's just evidence that you're frightened, nothing more than that. But once we begin interpreting perfectly normal fear sensations as signs of danger, we create a second layer of fear that was never needed in the first place. I spoke to someone once who told me a story about a time when they could feel a sneeze coming on, and then suddenly it just went away. And we all know that feeling. Is there anything more frustrating and unsatisfying than needing to sneeze, but for some reason you can't? But in this case, even though this person had experienced an elusive phantom sneeze before, for some reason this time they started to worry that now they might have lost the ability to sneeze. Even worse, they then went on to wonder and even worry about if that can have an impact on their brain function. Before you could say bless you, they'd started to freak out about the possibility of imminent brain damage and inevitable death from an imagined sneeze dysfunction. And whilst that might seem ridiculous, it's surprising how often our mind creates a concern about something entirely benign and harmless. And why does this happen? Because our mind makes mistakes. Before we go any further, have you checked out the members area of this channel? In there, you'll find hours and hours of extra anxiety and mind coaching content, including my full control system training and the Clear Your Head Anxiety Relief Program. You'll also get full access to exclusive weekly live Q&As. It's just £9 for a full month's access, and you can join by hitting the button on the homepage or clicking the link in the description of this video. See you there. There's another mistake I think almost everybody with anxiety makes at some point, although we don't usually notice we're doing it. It's the strange belief many of us cling to that worrying about something somehow keeps us safe from it. If you've ever caught yourself thinking, it's a good job I thought about that because imagine if I hadn't, you'll know what I mean. Or perhaps you've tried to talk yourself into worrying less, but it just doesn't feel safe to do that. It's almost as though part of us believes that by predicting disaster, we've somehow prevented it. We might even regard the fact the thing we braced ourselves for didn't happen is because the worrying about it somehow stopped it happening, which of course isn't true. No, honestly, it's not. The reason the terrible thing you imagine usually doesn't happen is much simpler than that. The reason is that life is just incredibly unpredictable. There are literally millions of possible outcomes to every single day. As much as life is pretty mundane, as we've already mentioned, we've still never accurately predicted every conversation, every item on the news, every email in our inbox. It just can't be done. The chances of that thing we're worrying about being exactly what unfolds are infinitesimally small. Of course it didn't happen as predicted. But because the disaster didn't happen, it's easy to give the worrying the credit, as though the act of imagining it somehow protected us. Well, good news, it didn't. You simply guessed wrong. You were simply mistaken, just as your mind will be thousands and thousands of times throughout your life. So does all this mean you're broken? Not even close. In fact, I'd argue it means exactly the opposite. Healthy human beings make mistakes. We mishear lyrics. We walk into rooms and forget why we came in here. We mistake one person for another from the other side of the street. Our minds are constantly making educated guesses based on incomplete information. Most of those mistakes don't bother us because they don't carry any emotional weight. Yet anxiety feels different, simply because fear convinces us the mistake really matters. But whatever particular flavor of anxious thought we're having, it's still just a mistake, not a malfunction. There's a sentence that I often come back to when I'm talking to my clients. The way it feels is not the way it is. When we're frightened, the world feels dangerous. It feels like we can't cope. It feels like we're about to be consumed and overwhelmed. But none of those feelings tell us what's actually true. It simply tells us we're looking at the world through the lens of fear. And fear has never been a reliable narrator. That's why it's worth allowing yourself the possibility that you've simply misunderstood what your own mind is doing. And that's not because you're foolish, and it's certainly not because you're weak, but because every healthy human mind shares one very human characteristic. It frequently gets things wrong. If the ideas discussed in this video are resonating with you and you'd like my personal guidance to help you get the other side of anxiety, then follow the link in the comments to book a free, no obligation consultation. And if you found this video helpful, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for weekly videos on anxiety and understanding how the mind works. But that's it for this one. I'm Tim Box. Always remember, be kind to your mind. I'll see you next time.